George Kilpatrick, and you have access to the unfiltered voices of our guests. Manlius physician Dr. Rafil Dhafir, convicted of violating U.S. sanctions against Iraq, money laundering, and fraud, will be sentenced tomorrow morning in federal court. His supporters, though, have not given up hope and want to educate the public about what they say is unfair treatment by an overzealous government because Dr. Dhafir is a Muslim. Now their hope is for a compassionate sentence, and they're here to shed light on things in the trial that you, up to this point, they say, you have not heard. Joining us is Barrie Gewanter from the Central New York chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union. Welcome, Barrie.
Thank you, George.
Also joining us is Katherine Hughes. She's an educator, an activist, and a court watcher. She and Julienne Oldfield, sitting next to her, have been watching the trial, and they say a lot of the things that they saw in the courtroom never got reported in the media. They're here to set the record straight and give you some information and insights as to links that they say the government is making, but in fact they did not see after watching the trial. I'm going to go over to you because you are ordinary people who I believe got an email from Barrie saying that they're looking for people to stand up, and this is how you came to this. You're just ordinary people.
Yes, but I'm an ordinary person with a very strong concern for civil liberties. As a 14-year-old, I watched a documentary of the Allies going into Auschwitz, and for the last 30 years I've read about what happened in Germany, and I see many similarities. So my concern is much wider. It's for civil liberties in this country and what I see happening.
You say you see similarities to what has happened to Dr. Dhafir, to what happened in Germany?
I do. I think the Muslim population in this country at this time are being targeted in a not dissimilar way as happened in Germany. It didn't happen overnight. It started with people losing their jobs, like Osama al-Wahidi, who was sacked without any review from Oswego. And we progress along, you know, from the early 30s to 45 was 15 years. I'm alarmed at the similarities I see.
And Julienne, how did you come to this?
Well, I was deeply concerned ever since the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, and then as sanctions were enforced and the people of Iraq were clearly suffering, I, and along with a lot of other people from central New York, were deeply concerned. And then came Dr. Dhafir's trial, and as a result of that, I came to hear and to watch, and then joined the whole group of us who became court watchers.
And we'll get to what you saw in the trial in a moment. But Barrie, the issue for you is whether or not you've been on the show before. Your issue and your concern is on the civil liberties front. You've talked about Patriot Act, the use of Patriot Act, and in this case, whether a Muslim in this country can get a fair trial.
Right. We were actually alerted to the situation in the Dhafir case when 150 Muslim families who had made donations in good faith to the charity that Dr. Dhafir ran. These 150 Muslim families were all interrogated on one day, the same day he was arrested. And this occurred in ways that may have been inappropriate, and it happened on one day between 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. in the morning. We were first contacted by the mosque in Syracuse asking about civil liberties implications, and then we became aware of the implications in the Dhafir case itself.
So what is the civil liberties position, and what have you seen?
Well, we had concerns in the beginning of this trial as to whether there was selective enforcement of the law. The main law that he is said to violate is something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, which is how the U.S. Imposes economic sanctions on another country because we feel that they're engaged in terrorism or some other threat against the United States. Dr. Dhafir is accused of sending money and goods with humanitarian purposes to Iraq in violation of those sanctions.
In fact, money laundering. They said that he was convicted of conspiracy to defraud the United States because the charity was not legally recognized, they say, as an IRS tax-exempt organization, so those contributions were in fact not used appropriately.
Well, there were 60 charges that were filed against him, and they involve transgressing those sanctions, that IEEPA law. They also involve the operation of the charity. Our concern is to whether or not these laws that he was said to have violated were prosecuted in an overzealous way, in an especially zealous way, because he was a prominent Muslim American in our community.
Do you think that your cause and your cause for civil liberties, he is going to be sentenced tomorrow? I mean, that is going to happen. I know there's a campaign to have his sentence be compassionate, and a lot of people will hopefully get a chance to testify to the fact that he was all these things, and some of those things you'll talk about tonight. But what can you do now?
Well, the important thing is that when civil liberties are at issue, that people do not let that happen behind closed doors, and that's why we put out the call to observers. Also, there was a lot of inflammatory publicity about this case prior to the commencement of the trial. The Attorney General of the United States and the Governor of New York suggesting that this case had terrorist links, when it did not, when there were never any charges that there were terrorist links, and in fact the prosecution worked hard to keep that out of the case. And yet this inflammatory publicity really had an effect on the beginning of the trial.
The other defendants in the case, there were 4 people, I believe, were all either they pled or they struck deals. I mean, does that hurt the cause?
Well, the cause is American democracy. The cause is the idea that everybody in the United States is entitled to equal protection under the law. And one of the most important facets of that is that we are all presumed innocent until proven guilty. And in this case, the case was pursued as if the defendant, who was accused of what is essentially white-collar crime, was presumed guilty before the trial even began, and presumed guilty of much more simply than operating a charity in ways that violated U.S. and New York state law.
You know, you said, Katherine, that what you saw in the courtroom was very different than what was reported in the paper. Now, what did the paper see that you didn't see, or what did you see that the paper didn't see?
I had never actually read the Post-Standard before this trial, and each day after the proceedings, when I read the articles, things that I thought were extremely important that gave a valid defence were not covered. And I've written to the Post-Standard constantly. I have had an email exchange with John O'Brien. Their coverage was shockingly inadequate.
What did the Post-Standard fail to tell the rest of us that you saw in the courtroom, and what difference would that have made?
I feel they didn't present both sides of the story, and that is all that I have ever wanted for Dr. Dhafir, is that he gets a fair hearing, and I don't believe that they gave him a fair hearing. And so I actually started a website because I got so distressed with the coverage. You started
blogging on your own?
I started trying to give people access to another view of what was happening in the proceedings. And I've lobbied for a whole year now, various people in the community. 150 Muslim families were interviewed. Many of them were from the Syracuse University community. 3 of the defendants are Syracuse University graduates who were highly respected by their professors. I have a good friend who's the main professor of one of them. And I have been unable to get the university involved. I've been to the law school, the Newhouse School, the Maxwell School, the National Security and Counter-Terrorism Institute, Dean Wolfe. Nobody even wants
to touch this.
To touch it.
So, but let me go back to, because you said to me that part of your concern in this trial, the way this trial was presented, was that there is a cultural gap, that there are cultural norms at play that are normal for Iraqi, he's an Iraqi person of Iraqi descent, Muslim of Iraqi descent, that there's some norms in that culture that perhaps our system didn't recognize. That's one thing. But the other thing is, I still need you to be clear about what you saw in the trial that in the paper was reported a different way, and what that coverage, how that coverage you think affected any outcomes.
Well, what I felt wasn't covered was the cultural context that you are talking about, which is a very, very important context.
And you saw that at play in the courtroom?
I did. I mean, these people who have a different way of operating, it's not illegal, but it can look highly suspicious. For example, Mrs. Dhafir had a safety deposit box that had $100,000 in cash, and this was presented as something highly suspicious. But for an Arab Muslim culture, where the norm is that a lot of business is transacted in cash, this wasn't abnormal. And not only that, it wasn't being hidden from the government. That $100,000, as well as any other cash that the Dhafirs had, was listed with their lawyer as assets that they had.
Julienne?
Well, in answer to your question, the tone of most of what John O'Brien wrote in the Post-Standard was plainly inflammatory. He picked on words, he used words that were not even mentioned during the trial, because we had sat there writing. I also did some drawing, but when there were plenty of people writing, or when there weren't, I wrote. And on particular days, he used words, and he kept repeating the indictments as if they were judgments, rather than telling the story of what was happening each day with each of the witnesses. And we've touched already on the fact that all of these 150 Muslim families had no chance really to consider how they would deal with their doors being banged upon and in some cases broken into. They didn't have any time to consider how they would deal with this. So they were taken on that one day, as a result of which it seems to us that Dr. Dhafir, his whole defense was put in jeopardy because of this.
I have to say that the ACLU is not going to be telling the media how to cover a story or not cover a story. So I have to be very clear that we have no argument with the newspaper. But I think that it's very important to look at ways in which this case was pursued in ways that white-collar crime cases normally are not. For instance, the doctor was denied bail and remained in jail for 2 years before he went to trial. How often does an accused white-collar criminal, we're talking about a nonviolent crime and a first offender, get completely denied bail prior to trial? That's very unusual.
Because they believe, wasn't suspected that there was a terrorist link, that there was the possibility of that.
Actually, the prosecution argued against any mention of an investigation into terrorism, argued vociferously against it, that there was no terrorism involved here. This was a white-collar crime, and they brought in all sorts of detail to show where the white-collar crime occurred. But if it was a white-collar crime, then why was he denied bail? And that put very severe impediments on the defense prior to trial because of a very restrictive jail visiting policy.
You know, this is, when you think about this, then, are you saying that what then are you saying is the reason why you think this particular case received this attention? And it's the only case in the United States that has been, where someone has been convicted of violating U.S. sanctions, as I understand
Well,
it?
it's interesting because under the IEEPA law, the government can either file criminal charges or impose a monetary fine. And there have been major American companies, RC Crown Cola, ESPN, and other companies that have done business with Iraq while the sanctions were in place, and they got a monetary fine. And no CEO was ever brought up with criminal charges. To our knowledge, the only types of people that have had criminal charges filed against them for trying to do humanitarian work in Iraq were Muslims and Arabs. And that raises serious questions about selective enforcement.
So, again, the sentencing schedule for tomorrow morning, there will be opportunities for folk to make statements. What is your hope now? I mean, one of the things that we said we wanted to do was to bring, or you said you wanted to do through this program, was to educate the public about the other side of the issues. One of those issues includes the scheme as he was convicted of with Medicare. The attempt. They say that he was convicted of making false
overcharging to Medicare.
Yeah. That's a perfect example of what wasn't covered by the newspaper. As someone who attended the trial, the things didn't add up, and actually the money that Dr. Dhafir billed from his practice to Medicare, 80 to 90% of it went on medication that actually went to patients, which meant that only 10 to 20% covered the doctor's time, the nurse's time, and lab work. How many medical practices could say that? And none of that was presented, and to me that was a very simple thing that a reporter could go and look at this evidence and deduce.
But Katherine, is your concern the government, or is your concern the newspaper coverage? Because through your blog, you're able to talk about these issues. But if your concern is with the paper, that's one thing. Does the government, and I ask this of all of you, does the United States government, they got a conviction. They will say that they presented their case to a jury convicted this physician, and they got convictions in every indictment. Just about the 4 people that were involved, all of them were charged with something. And they got the conviction. So I think people watching the program are saying, well, look, they presented their case.
Yep.
How can you argue? What can you argue about in this case that the government wasn't able to prove? They proved they would say to you, he was guilty of 59 of 60 counts. Case closed. What is it to argue about?
I really don't know about the jury. To me, it was shocking, although not unexpected, because I had done enough reading that the guilty verdict came back. But I have 8 notebooks that I wrote for 5 hours for 17 weeks. The volume of information was enormous. I don't believe that Dr. Dhafir ever gave the right to be held innocent. The government talked out of both sides of their mouth from the beginning of the trial, saying he was a terrorist and not allowing him to defend himself. And that was a problem I had with the paper. The paper never tackled that. You know, what's this going on with Ashcroft saying Dhafir's a terrorist, or Pataki just before the trial started? and the prosecutors not letting that come up to court. So these questions, burning questions that we should be discussing.
And Julienne, I know that one of the things that I know you want to get in here.
Well, I would really like to just add the fact that Dr. Dhafir came over as such a beautiful person. Okay, you could say we were hoodwinked, but I don't think so. He's a spiritual leader of this Muslim community, the Islamic Society of Central New York. He's deeply respected. They are deeply hurt. And he did everything he could to not entangle these people whom he cares for so much, so that he was taking the burden of the responsibility of what he had done in forming Help the Needy, in getting it organized, in getting that money sent out so that it would reach people in need in his country of birth, in Iraq.
And in the operation of that charity, which was stated to have a solely humanitarian purpose, certainly mistakes were made in the operation and the accounting of the charity. And steps should have been taken by the government to make sure that the charity was properly registered, that it had a proper tax-exempt number, and steps were being taken to clear up that kind of technical detail. The question is, should it have resulted in a federal prosecution with 60 charges, charges after charge after charge? In the case of Medicare charges, usually they demand a refund, and there's only criminal charges if that's not paid. In the case of a charity that's operating with a tax-exempt number that's borrowed from another charity, usually New York State comes in from the Attorney General's office, would close down the charity until things are cleaned up and it can operate again. Why was this such a zealous prosecution? Was it because he was a prominent Muslim in this area and a leader?
Do you think that, so the view then is that all Muslim charities you think are under suspicion?
They're under a higher level of suspicion than other charities. And we've seen this in the Congress, the Senate probing Muslim charities, the Department of Justice probing Muslim charities. And one of the things that people don't understand is that it is actually a religious obligation within the Muslim faith to provide help to the needy. It's referred to as zakat. And one of the cultural gaps is that this concept of zakat, and I'm just learning about this because of this trial, there's a variety of different ways within the Muslim culture to provide help for the needy, including things like providing assistance to married couples in getting their first apartment. And that would not seem like help to the needy to most Americans, but it's part of one of the types of zakat that is acceptable within Muslim culture. And that sort of gap in understanding did have an effect on the trial.
Because the federal prosecutors were not able to understand that. I mean, their job is to get a conviction, and if they can create the sense and relate to the jurors, wouldn't they do what they had to do?
Technically, they may have proved their point. Certainly, they convinced the jury. But the whole way that this case was pursued really leads us to raise questions as to whether a Muslim in the United States can truly get a fair trial.
You're coming right back to that. I mean, that's...
We have serious questions as a result of this case and others. This is a country that has become quite hostile to the civil liberties of Muslim Americans.
You know, Katherine, with just about a minute left, I think the point is, what do you hope happens tomorrow? I mean, he's facing potentially 24 years, I guess.
24 to 30.
24 to 30 years.
I fully expect that he'll get 24 to 30 years, and I'm prepared for that. And at the moment, I am going through the indictment on my website telling people why I don't think the government proved their case.
But you're calling it Free Rafil Dhafir. I mean that's the campaign is Free Rafil.
No,
Dhafir.
this is another website that has a completely different approach. That website is mainly about Dr. Dhafir.
Okay.
My website is Dr. Dhafir in a civil liberties context, in
Okay.
a much wider global context, national context. And I just feel it's my civic duty to inform people whether they want to be or not.
And I would like people to realize that this man, Dr. Rafil Dhafir, is essentially a really good, deeply good person. And the tragedy is, in the courts here in Syracuse, he is being convicted.
Well, the sentencing is tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, and the thoughts and prayers, I'm sure, of you go out to his family. If you want to find out more about this cause, visit the website dhafirtrial.net. dhafirtrial.net. Katherine Hughes is putting that together, and she will keep you posted, she promises, through her blogs following this trial. Katherine Hughes, Julienne Oldfield, and Barrie Gewanter from the American Civil Liberties Union, Central New York chapter, thank you for joining us.